friend of mine recently sent me a text asking me what I thought about his doctor's suggestion that he go on statins. That's this week's discussion. Stay tuned. First, I'd like to remind everybody that anything you hear or see on this channel are suggestions and information and not advice. I often get questions, people ask me, well, what should I do? Unfortunately, I really can't tell you what you should do. All I can do is provide you with information that you can use in making your decision. And so it was in this case. So let's talk about Dan. Dan is a strong and seemingly healthy person in the prime of his life. He's in his early 40s. He exercises regularly. He's not overweight. He eats at what I call moderate standard American diet. He doesn't go overboard on things, though he told me he did have a weakness for cake. He loves cake. And he does eat whole grain breads and starches and that sort of thing. His doctor looked at his lipid panel and has suggested that he start taking statins. So let's get a little context of this. First, he did get the usual discussion about being on them for the rest of your life, even though that rarely actually happens. There was no discussion of the causes or effects, inflammation, lifestyle. The doctor did order a coronary artery calcium test because he pushed back a little because he just doesn't like the idea of medications in general. And this was the first time his lipids were measured. The doctor looked at a single blood test and said, oh, you need to be on statins. This is what I call assembly line medicine, or more precisely, McMedicine. So here are Dan's numbers. He's 41 years old. His BMI is 22.4. His total cholesterol is, and I'm speaking statistically, very high. It's not a value judgment that is very high. It's just statistically it's very high compared to most people in the world. His LDL cholesterol, I have a little asterisk next to that because in general, LDL cholesterol is normally calculated from what's called the Friedewald equation. And that's where they take the total cholesterol, which is measured, the HDL, which is measured, and the triglycerides, and by these formulas, depending on what your units are, they calculate LDL. So this trigs over 5 for milligrams per deciliter or trigs over 2.2 for millimoles per liter is an estimate of what we call remnant cholesterol. By the calculation, Dan's LDL should have been actually 260, and it was 240. So that tells me they weren't using the calculation. This was one of those rare cases where they did a measurement of the LDL, and it can be done. So apparently that's what they did here. A lot of people say that the equation's no good, you should always get it measured. They get excited when they hear that, well, my LDL is actually lower than what the equation said. That's not a good thing. And this is not a judgment on LDL. Whether you think LDL is not a problem or you think LDL is the worst thing ever, one thing that just about everybody agrees on is that remnant cholesterol, VLDL, or very low density lipoproteins, are actually the worst. If you have a calculated LDL of 260 and you get it measured, you find out it's only 240. That's bad, because for a given total cholesterol HDL measurement pair, the higher the LDL, the better. Counterintuitive as it seems, because that means the lower the remnant cholesterol. If your LDL is lower, then that means your remnant cholesterol is higher, and that's very bad. So in Dan's case, his triglycerides would indicate his remnant cholesterol should have been about 44 milligrams per deciliter. Instead, it was 64 milligrams per deciliter. It was actually worse. His trigs to HDL ratio was 5.1. His blood pressure was actually very good. His Lp(a) was not taken, and that's not unusual. Lp(a), as important as it is something that you kind of get into when you're really interested in honing in on what your actual risk is. The CAC, which is the coronary artery calcium score, that test is planned. They didn't do LDL fractionation, and that's not unusual either for the same reason with Lp(a). Most doctors don't know anything about it. He's likely to be pattern B anyway, given what his trigs to HDL ratio is, so I'm not sure you'd get a lot more information from that. And pattern B is the bad pattern and pattern A is the good pattern. HSCRP, that's high sensitivity C-reactive protein, was also not taken, and that's an important measure of inflammation. So that kind of is a little disturbing that the HSCRP wasn't taken. And then finally, this is very concerning, his HbA1c wasn't taken. This doctor is only looking at cholesterol. They're not even looking at insulin resistance or diabetes. And while the HbA1c can quite often give false negatives, it's at least a starting point. If the HbA1c indicates somebody has high insulin resistance, it's probably accurate. It can actually be low and say there isn't insulin resistance when there really is. So that's what I mean by false negatives. So this is very concerning to me that this doctor wasn't considering his whole health and was just looking at the lipid panel. My first step in helping Dan out was figuring out what his risk is. These are the 10-year risk calculators, and I know that we don't always put a lot of stock into them, but they give us a first pass order of magnitude guess at what his 10-year risk is. And each of these calculators has a problem in Dan's case. The Framingham calculator is known to overestimate risk for people who don't have cardiovascular disease. And that's the one that gave us the highest value, but I'm not even going to be able to use that because we know it's an overestimate. The MESA calculator is the one that considers CAC, the coronary artery calcium score. And if Dan came back with a score of 0, his risk would actually be a little bit lower than is shown here. The MESA calculator will also give us a value if there are no CAC score available, and it puts him at 5.5%. And that's a value I'm going to use for the rest of the discussion. There is a caveat here. This calculator only goes down to age 45. I put in age 41. It said, no, we can't do it for that. It's got to be age 45 and above. So his actual risk is probably a little bit lower than 5.5% according to this calculator, simply because age is a risk factor and it's kind of linear. The older you are, the higher the risk. The pooled cohort equation calculators, they also have a limitation, and that is that they won't work for total cholesterol over 320 milligrams per deciliter. And when I went online to put in the values, it actually just rejected it. It said, no, we're not going to do a calculation for that. I have an offline version of the equations, and I just applied the equations to his actual numbers, and it came out with these values, a little bit lower than the MESA calculator. But since the developers of the risk calculator themselves say you can't use it with numbers this high, then we're going to just say, okay, we're not going to violate their rule, and we're not going to use that value. The Reynolds risk calculator requires an HSCRP, and like I noted, they didn't take one for Dan. So what I did was, in the calculator, I put in one that was about 15 times as high as mine to give him a high level of inflammation. And you can see that the Reynolds calculator came up with a relatively low value also. But just for the sake of argument, I'm comfortable taking this 5.5% as a tentative 10-year risk for Dan, so we can look at what that means for him. So now let's take a graphical look at Dan's risk and his risk reduction. First of all, we're going to use the MESA calculator value. The yellow area here is the 10-year risk that Dan's not going to have a cardiovascular event. The red and the green together are his 10-year risk if he's left untreated. And then if he is treated, that little green slice is the actual protection he's going to, in theory, get if we accept the Lipitor relative risk reduction as an example. This little green slice is the only benefit he's even going to get according to the best estimates of the pro-statin doctors. Dan may look at that, and here are the values. 10-year risk of 5.5%. He's getting a 2% reduction total. That means a number needed to treat of 50. 50 people just like Dan would have to be treated for 10 years to avoid one cardiovascular event. From a public health perspective, maybe that makes sense. From an individual perspective, I'm sure there are some individuals who say, well, yeah, I'll do that, even though it's overwhelming chance that it's not going to help them. It's a 98% chance that it's not going to help them at all, because either they're going to have the heart attack anyway, that 3.5% chance, or they were never going to have one, that 94.5% chance. Just saying that, well, you get the benefit of lowered cholesterol, well, that's meaningless. It's got to be in the context of, is it going to help the patient's health? And the main thing is, of course, cardiovascular disease risk. The next consideration is, of course, adverse effects. We see all different estimates of adverse effects. We're told that in the clinical setting, the adverse effects are much higher than in the randomized clinical trials. The randomized clinical trials quite often wash out the people who are going to have adverse effects, so you can't use that data to determine how frequent the adverse effects are. I think there are about 30 to 35% of all patients have some adverse effects. All these groups probably get the adverse effects to the same proportion. The harm does have to be weighted against what the benefit could be. For example, if it's just myalgia, a little bit of muscle pain, a particular patient may say, well, I'll put up with a little bit of muscle pain because a heart attack is just so bad, it's something I don't want to be subjected to, even though it's still more likely than not that they're still going to get the heart attack if they were bound to have one. The point is, Dan does have a lipid problem. Like I said, he's got the triglycerides, the HDL rate, so that's not very good. His HDL is not terrible, but it's not great. The minimum for men is supposed to be 40 milligrams per deciliter, and he's higher than that. He's at 43, but not particularly high. His triglycerides are very high, and his remnant cholesterol is also very bad. Now compare that to me. When I had these tests about 15 years ago, my triglycerides were even higher and my HDL was a lot lower, so my ratio was 7.45, so he's actually better off than I was then. So here are my closing thoughts. This is what I suggested for Dan. Consider this the start, not the end of your search for answers. Look at all this information that I've given you, watch other videos. It's not like you're going to go to the doctor, they take your cholesterol readings once, and you make a decision for all time. Let's learn a little bit about how all this stuff affects you. Your current 10-year risk is likely to be very low. Take advantage of your young age. He has a 20-year head start on me, and I managed to get my numbers in line from a quality point of view. He's got 20 extra years to do that. And I don't mean 20 years of just relaxing saying I'm not going to worry about it until I'm 61. It's much easier to correct it at age 41 than it is at age 61. Explore the reason why his lipid panel is what it is. For example, does he have familial hypercholesterolemia? And that's not simply a question of, oh, your father had it, your mother had high cholesterol, you've got familial hypercholesterolemia. It's a much more concise thing than that. It's genetic tests can sometimes show it if you have it, and there's a whole bunch of conditions that say you do have familial hypercholesterolemia, which includes family history, yes, but not just father had high cholesterol, I do. Well, maybe in both your cases it was because of diet. Fourth, view your health holistically. Don't just look at cholesterol in isolation, which is what your doctor is doing. Look at insulin resistance. Learn how that affects your heart risk. Triglycerides, sure, that data was taken, but how about fatty liver? How about plaque buildup? A CIMT, carotid intimate media thickness test, can give you information of that. You know, your inflammation levels, HSCRP is one measure of it. Those are all the things that impact cardiovascular risk. It's not just lipid panel quantities. Don't stop at the first lifestyle adjustment. And you notice I said adjustment here. I hate telling people, oh, you got to do a lifestyle change. No, just adjust your lifestyle. If the results aren't as expected, don't give up. Figure out what works for you. Cut the starches and sugars. If he loves cake, maybe only eat cake twice a month instead of 3 times a week or whatever it happens to be. Avoid the seed oils. Watch the processed carbohydrates. I think, except for his weakness for cake, I think he's probably doing pretty well at that. But remember, bread, white bread especially, is a processed carbohydrate. So watch out for that. Watch out for the pastas. Eat whole foods and stop fearing healthy fats like you can get from various cuts of meat are actually good for you. And then consider intermittent fasting. Next, consider home monitoring of blood glucose in your cholesterol panel. I use a CuraFit L5 for blood glucose and a CuraFit L7 for looking at my cholesterol panel. Dan is an engineer, so it's something that will help him stay the course if he so desires. Finally, statins should never be the first line response to perceived cardiovascular risk. There are so many other things that can and should be done to reduce your cardiovascular risk. To reach right for the prescription bottle, that's malpractice. Now, we haven't heard the doctor's side of this. I'm only hearing Dan's side of this. The doctor may have other reasons that we don't know about. From appearances, it just seems like this is what one other YouTube channel called checkbox medicine, or Mick medicine as I call it. To me, this kind of embodies what's really wrong with the medical profession, at least in the Western world. So I'd like to know your thoughts. Did I suggest properly to Dan? What do you think he's going to do? Is he going to adjust his lifestyle, eat more whole foods and healthy fats, adjust his diet to see if he can get the lipid panel quality improved? Is he going to just go ahead and take the statins? Is he just going to ignore the whole thing, say, it sounds too hard to do anything about it right now? Let me know in the comments, what do you think he's going to do? So that's what I've got on this topic. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topics or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.